Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of the foXnoMad podcast. I'm your host, foXnoMad Anil Polat. My guest today is Dr. Eugene Rogan. He is a professor at Oxford. He is also the author of the book The Arabs and several other books on the Arab world. He is a historian who focuses on the Middle East and North Africa. So we talk a little bit about that history that you may not know about. We talk about how decisions in the past have led us to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict today. What are some potential solutions and some bright spots in the Middle East and North Africa looking forward? We get into all of that on today's episode. I think you're going to enjoy this one very much. Hi, Eugene, and welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for taking the time to do this. As we were talking
Thanks,
before,
Anil. Pleasure to be with you.
and before like I said before I hit record, that I had read your book, The Arabs, A History, and I found it so fascinating because I thought, well, I kind of have a general idea of the of that part of the world. But I really didn't. What got you into, Middle East, North African history? What started your interest in that area?
The origins of my contact with this region go right back to my childhood. And born in California, my father worked in the aerospace industry. And when I was 6, he took the whole family first to Europe and then to the Middle East. We reached Beirut in January of 71, which means that for over half a century, I have either lived in, studied, or taught the Middle East. So 5 years in Beirut, 3 years in Cairo in the 1970s, tumultuous decade full of just history changing events. And I got to live through all of that. And I think it left a mark on me forever. Nothing has ever seemed as interesting to me as the modern Arab world.
And when I was reading the book, the one point that I really took away from it is when we say the Arabs, right? So we think of Iraq and, let's say, Libya, and we sort of just think of it as all one thing, right? So, and you dispel that misconception in the book. Why do we have that perception, and what is the reality?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, in calling the book The Arabs, I'm guilty of the same thing of kind of homogenizing a very diverse group of people whose greatest common feature is they all speak Arabic. And there's a kind of geosphere that stretches from Morocco on the Atlantic coast right through North Africa, Egypt, the Fertile Crescent of Greater Syria, Iraq, all the Arabian Peninsula, right down to Oman on the Arabian Sea. And the one thing all those countries have in common is the Arabic language. It's the language of their print media. All their newspapers are published in exactly the same Arabic. But that masks the diversity of the Arab peoples because across that same geography, you have, a dozen very distinctive different dialects, some of them mutually incomprehensible. Personally, I have a very hard time managing in Arabic when I'm in Tunisia or Morocco because their own variant of Arabic is so inflected with Tamazight or Berber words and expressions. And I think they probably have difficulty dealing with a much more Arabian Bedouin dialect that you would find in the Persian Gulf or the Syrian desert. So a lot of diversity there in architecture, in cuisine, in historical experience, and yet a real sense of common mission, purpose, and vision that through the Arabic language binds the people of the Arab world together.
And in the book, you sort of describe what sort of created this perception, right? So you start around, the rise against Ottoman rule is sort of where you started. And for people listening and watching, what might they not understand about the Arab history up until that point?
So I've decided to write a modern history of the Arab world. I'm a modern historian myself. A lot of my predecessors writing big surveys of the Arab world started with the rise of Islam. So Philip Hitti with his early 20th century classic, or the great Albert Hourani, who founded the Middle East Center that I now direct. They all began with the prophetic mission of Muhammad in the 7th century. And I think for many readers, they come to my book really hoping for some insight into that early period of Islam. But I'm just not the expert to give that to them. I've got a lot of colleagues who are much better versed on, late classical and medieval history. I decided to start with the Ottoman conquest of the Arab provinces The Ottomans entered Arab history in 1516 when, on campaign towards Persia, they decided they didn't want to leave their right flank exposed to the Mamluk Empire and decided to take a diversion and to go and conquer the Mamluk Empire instead. And in 1516, they make their way through Syria. By 1517, they take on the Mamluk capital of Cairo and add that to the Ottoman Sultan's dominions. And suddenly, what was a thriving successor state to the Byzantine Empire, concentrated mostly in the Balkans and in Anatolian Turkey, has now become the master of the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean, right through to Egypt and moving on across North Africa's deserts. So the Ottoman arrival in 1516 was, for me, the kind of harbinger of modernity. In my view, modern Arab history really has three or four phases. The first and longest is the Ottoman era, and the Ottoman era will go from the 16th century right through to the First World War. And then after that, we can talk about the role that European imperial powers will play in the 19th and 20th century. The Cold War powers will play after the Second World War. And then ultimately, after the end of the Cold War, the emergence of a period of unipolar politics dominated by the United States and the kind of global economy, which is the messy era that we're living in today. But the Ottomans, they really were, for the first 4 centuries of modern Arab history, the essential intermediary between the Arab world and the rest of the world.
And what sort of catalyst did they provide, did the Ottoman conquest provide to the Arab world? In other words, what did, you know, I assume, like, as a historian, you think about what would have happened had they not been conquered by the Ottomans, if something else had happened, if the Mamluk Empire had had continued and so on. What changed with the Ottomans' arrival?
The Ottomans were the most successful Islamic empire in the world by the time they conquered the Arab lands. The the Arabs, in a sense, did not see themselves being conquered and occupied by foreigners because already the Mamluks were a Turkish-speaking ruling elite, ruling from Cairo, it is true, a great Arab city, but nonetheless, it wasn't your language or your identity so much as your religion that defined the comfort zone of Arab subjects. And the fact that Mamluks were Sunni Muslims was very much in keeping with the new rulers, the Ottomans. The big change was that the Arabs would no longer be ruled through one of their own cities, but they would be ruled through Istanbul or Constantinople, the Ottoman capital. But I think for most Arabs not part of the Mamluk Empire's hierarchy, for the Mamluks, defeat was, of course, catastrophic, and many of them ended up on the gallows for their losses. But for the Arabs as a whole, they saw themselves integrated into not just the most successful Islamic empire in the world at that time, but the greatest single power in the whole of the Mediterranean. So it's hard to remember because one thinks about Ottoman decline, but the Ottomans in the 16th century were the terror of Europe. And Europe itself was not a powerful continent. It was a kind of squad of squabbling mini states and dukedoms and principalities that really could not raise an army to challenge the might of the Ottomans. Being part of that project was not such a bad gig for people in the Arab world. And if anything, most people signed on their loyalty to the Sultan. And if there were any challenges, it was from ambitious local leaders that the Ottomans were able to dispatch pretty easily. So the Ottomans were able to settle in and enjoy a good couple of centuries of uncontested domination over the Arab world with the full consent and buy-in of the Arab peoples. It would only be in the 18th century, as the Ottomans are beginning to enter into a kind of sclerosis of their governance and their military, no longer really being able to keep up with the leading European powers of the day. And the Ottomans' ability to really exercise the same degree of control over their Arab provinces is worn down. And then in the 18th century, you begin to see challengers emerging from Arab provinces who want to establish a kind of hereditary rule in places like Baghdad or Damascus or Palestine or Egypt. And the Ottomans would find it increasingly difficult to address those internal challengers, not so much, resisting Turkish rule as ambitious rulers looking to try and carve out some power for themselves.
And I imagine that those sort of initial states or I guess mini kingdoms or uprisings, as you call it, wouldn't look at all like the map that we see today of the Arab world, of the Arab states. Um, is that true? Because I'm imagining this, the Ottoman decline and what happened in Europe, and for I feel like there was a stronger national identity for, let's say, in Bulgaria or in in Greece and in Serbia and so on. And I'm not sure if the Arab states, I mean, I could be wrong, but I didn't have the same sort of national identity.
No one really was working at a national ideological level in the 18th century. You're really beginning to get the development of ideas of nationalism in the emergence of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And this is really when many of the European countries will begin to coalesce. You have some outliers. Obviously, I think England conquering Wales, Scotland, Ireland, seeing itself as a Great Britain, was already going down the path of a kind of self-defined national state. And the French, the Spanish, they too had histories that were leading them under their monarchies towards, integrated states. But that kind of national idea that you're talking about in the Balkans, for instance, that's really a kind of romantic liberal notion that emerges from the Enlightenment in the late 18th century and will come to shape the politics of the Mediterranean world in the 19th century. And Turks and Arabs and Kurds and Armenians and many other communities, Greeks, will at different times catch the nationalism bug. But I think that that's really going to be a development of the 19th century and maybe the only part of the Arab world we could point to that was already developing the trappings of a nation state in the early 19th century would be Egypt. And that when you had an ambitious governor emerge in Cairo at the very beginning of the 19th century, Muhammad Ali Pasha, who saw in Egypt the potential to provide a platform for empire building in its own right. And in the course of his near half century in government in Cairo, Muhammad Ali would take Egypt from being a province of the Ottoman Empire, becoming a kind of nation state in its own right. So Egypt was, in that sense, a forerunner of nation state nationalism in the Arab world. And I would not credit Muhammad Ali with any nationalism or indeed any ideology, anything bigger than the impulse to build an empire, at which he was incredibly successful. He adds to Egypt Sudan, the Hijaz Red Sea province that includes Mecca and Medina. At one point, all of Greater Syria, what we would call Syria, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan, and right up to Adana and into modern Turkey. He enjoyed rule over Crete. So we're talking about a serious territorial empire at the height of Muhammad Ali's power, all based in Egypt, and in a sense, almost a rival to the Ottoman center in Istanbul. It was with great difficulty and in collaboration with the European powers that the Ottoman sultans were able to contain Muhammad Ali within Egypt. But in the course of that half century, the beginning of the 19th century, you really saw Egypt kind of break away from the Ottoman provincial order, moving towards a more autonomous status as an Egyptian state in the making.
Yeah, you bring an interesting point. And then other states, when I was reading the book, I didn't know much about Algerian history, for example. And so you have these other colonial powers, right, invested in trying to take what's falling off of the Ottoman Empire. And how does that shape places like Algeria and the rest of the Middle East and North Africa?
Well, Algeria's history is so exceptional. There is no other example of that kind of conquest and settler colonialism. It's very early. The French invade Algeria in 1830. So well before you have any major European colonial appropriation. I mean, the French did briefly occupy Egypt between 1798 and 1801 under Napoleon, but it was a failed bid, and it was as much a bid to pressure Egypt's centrality to Britain's roads to India as it was about trying to create an empire in Egypt in its own right. So take Napoleon out of the picture. 1830 is really the beginning of European colonial expansion. And what they do in Algeria is completely illogical. It was a bid by the failing Bourbon King Charles X to overturn his falling popularity at home with adventures abroad. And no sooner do they invade Algeria than Charles is overthrown in a revolution in France in 1830. And his successors of the Orleans family would just continue the process because they didn't know really what else to do. And the French will extend their rule from the coastal regions right across coastal Algeria and then try and penetrate to the interior. And they actually go to work in trying to settle this territory with French farmers and ultimately will go on to annex the territory so that already in the 19th century, Algeria stops being a colony and is treated as part of metropolitan France with three different départements, each sending deputies to the French Assembly. When by the 20th century, the French insisted that Algeria was France, they meant it. It was annexed territory. They saw France as a country that straddled the north and south shores of the Mediterranean. So Algeria was put down a course not towards independent nation statehood. As the French were drawing boundaries around Algeria, it wasn't to create a separate Algerian state. It was to create a colonial territory that would be annexed to France and become an integral part of France. So a totally exceptional, and for that reason, the history of Algeria, utterly fascinating part of the Arab experience.
Yeah, I found that part of the book very interesting. A lot of history I didn't know. And so, we get to this point where we have all of the Ottomans are gone or in significant decline. We have other colonial powers coming in. And I feel, it seems like that's about the time where we start to sort of see the shape of the map we know today to some extent. Is that correct? Is that when the borders start being drawn in North Africa and of course, in the Middle East? Is that when that process begins?
Well, you can draw a real line in chronology between pre-World War One and post-World War state building. And before the outbreak of the First World War, every inch of North African coastline had been colonized by a European power and carved into a separate state entity. As we said, it starts with the French in Algeria in 1830. The next territory will be Tunisia, which also goes to France in 1881. In 1882, you have the British occupation of Egypt. You will have the Italian invasion and occupation of Libya in 1911. And France completes the conquest of North Africa with the establishment of a protectorate over Morocco in 1912. And Spain is the only other power to join that European carve up with long established presidios or enclaves on North Africa. Still, Ceuta and Melilla are Spanish enclaves in North Africa today, sort of the mirror image of Britain's enclave in Gibraltar, if you like, for Spain and North Africa, but also the Western Sahara, formerly known as the Spanish Sahara. So Spain, France, Italy, Britain, all carving up every inch of North Africa already by 1914. And then what follows in the course of the First World War, through what I would call partition diplomacy, Britain, France, and Russia try to agree not just how to defeat the Ottoman Empire, who was allied with Germany in the First World War against the Entente powers, but how to carve up Ottoman territory once they beat them to prevent any future imperial rivalries between Russia, Britain, and France that might follow the First World War in the event that they won. And that partition diplomacy will lead to a carve up. It's often referred to in popular memory as Sykes-Picot, but Sykes-Picot was really just one agreement and a whole series of agreements that saw partition diplomacy evolve between 1915 and 1920. But it's at the end of that process that, with the establishment of the League of Mandates, you'll have Iraq and Transjordan and Palestine being established in distinct frontiers and placed under British mandate, and Syria and Lebanon, similarly in defined frontiers, coming under a French mandate, leaving really only the territories of the Arabian Peninsula that were undergoing conquest by the forces of Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the ruler of what is now Saudi Arabia, who was consolidating from central Nejd in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula, first towards the Persian Gulf, then towards the Red Sea, to create what becomes really the Arab superstate of the 20th century, and that entirely outside any European state building process. And there we get kind of the map of the Middle East as you know it today.
And those borders, when they're being drawn, are they being drawn around, is it more colonial power, in terms of, okay, this is a French territory, or the British would like this access to this river and so on? Are they cultural borders, or is that completely disregarded? What's the logic between those lines?
It really is colonial convenience that is the driving logic on how the borders are drawn. And there's a great deal of negotiation that goes on, let's say, between Britain and France in trying to agree the boundary between Transjordan and Syria, between Palestine and Lebanon. And the British very concerned to try and contain the expansionist ambitions of Ibn Saud in Saudi Arabia by forcing him to the table to agree on limits to the spread of his sovereign territory with agreements to protect borders for Iraq and Jordan. So the Europeans are really the ones who come with this alien notion of borders in the European sense and impose them on a region. And they do so, as I said, without consulting with any of the local players and without their buy-in, without their consent. And as a result, though the borders that the Europeans laid down for the Middle East have proven to survive the past century, they also have embedded within them the sources of many of the conflicts that have defined the Middle East.
And I think when people think of borders and conflicts in the Middle East, especially now, they think about Israel and the Palestinians. And I don't, after reading the book, I didn't realize what that history had looked like up until that point. I think a lot of people don't know. So for those listening and watching who don't understand, or the current situation, what is how did that history lead up to where we are now, in the borders? And I think there's confusion over settlements. So people hear these words, but they don't quite understand what's actually happening and what brought it to this point in time.
You know, Anil, it is such a complex issue that it really is the material for an entirely separate podcast, indeed, a series of podcasts. But if I wanted to distill it down to what is the essence of the conflict between Israel and Palestinians, it's something that the British set in motion in the very terms of their mandate over Palestine. Britain had, for its own strategic reasons, decided that Palestine was essential for the security of the Suez Canal. Basically, though Britain was in control of all of Egypt, right through the Sinai Peninsula, up to the frontiers with the then Ottoman Empire in Palestine, there is no water source in all of the Sinai Peninsula. You can't station troops in the Sinai. And they learned in the course of the First World War that an enemy in Palestine, with access to the last water resources in southern Palestine around Beersheba and Gaza, could be a threat, not just to Egypt and Sinai, but to the Suez Canal itself. The Ottomans managed to drag artillery within 5 miles of the Suez Canal, from which point they could fire very accurately on British shipping in the canal during the First World War. So the British decided that they needed Palestine. They needed to renegotiate that away from Russia and France. And they decided it was easier to do that, not out of imperial greed or self-interest, but in defense of a big historic idea like the resolution of the Jewish question, the restoration of the Jewish people to their biblical homeland. And in that sense, the alliance between Lloyd George's government in Britain and the Zionist movement that gave rise to the Balfour Declaration in 1917 is not so much a conversion of Lloyd George's government to Zionism as it's Lloyd George harnessing the idea of Zionism to advance British imperial aims in Palestine. But what they put in motion was not to create a Jewish state. Britain wanted Palestine for its empire. It wasn't trying to give it away to a third party. They wanted to use the Zionist movement as willing partners in managing what they anticipated would be Arab resistance to British colonial rule. So they framed the promise to the Zionist movement not in terms of statehood, and they don't mention Zionism, but they promised the establishment of a Jewish national home so long as that didn't compromise the civic and religious rights of the non-Jewish population of Palestine. And from the very beginning, the British framed what they were doing not so much as managing national ideas as managing religious differences or religious communities. But what they set in motion was, of course, a conflict between Zionism, which was the Jewish nationalist movement, with its aim to establish a Jewish nation state in Palestine. That was Zionism. And an emerging Palestinian national identity, a new identity because it was created within boundaries of a new state laid down by the Mandate in Palestine, but one which took shape very quickly in the 1920s and 30s under the dual pressures of British imperialism. The Palestinian Arabs did not wish to be under British rule, and the threat of Zionism, which through land purchase and immigration was growing demographically and territorially in a way that Palestinians felt threatened the future of their land. And so a distinctive Palestinian national movement began to emerge in the 1920s, took firm shape in the 1930s, until by 1936 you had the beginning of a Palestinian national revolt against the British. And it's only then that the British convene a commission of inquiry under Lord Peel, and they recognize for the first time that what they've done in Palestine is they set in motion, and this is the language of the Peel Commission's report, rivalry between incompatible national movements. And recognizing they couldn't resolve the differences between Palestinian Arab claims and Zionist claims to the same territory, they recommended in 1937 partition, carved the land into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, and in this way resolved the difference. This was not a novel idea for the British. They had tried it in Kashmir, they tried it in Cyprus, they tried it in Ireland. But as you will know, Anil, Kashmir, Cyprus, and Ireland have all been war zones ever since. So it's not a new idea and it's not a good idea, but it's the idea with which we have been saddled ever since. And in a sense, I could telescope the remainder of the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis down to this conflict between rival and incompatible national movements and how you carve the land in a way that both sides can live with. And here we are, a ceasefire has just been declared to bring the Gaza war following the 7th of October attacks to an end. The international community is calling yet again for the creation of a Palestinian state. So basically back to the partition idea on the 22% of the land that Israel didn't conquer in 1948, but did in the June 1967 war. Those territories are the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. And with the two communities more or less at a demographic parity, there are about 7.2 million Israeli Jews. And if you add Palestinian Arabs who are citizens of Israel or living in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, or Gaza, you get about 7.2, 7.3 million Palestinian Arabs. With these two populations more or less at parity, it's very hard to see how there is a future that will bring peace to these war-torn communities that doesn't satisfy these long-standing rival and incompatible national demands, Palestinian, Arab, and Israeli.
And it seems like the more time that passes, the solutions seem to get more complicated. There's more bad blood, and I guess the people just ask what is the ideal solution. So if you were to say, how could dividing up the land, hasn't worked, right? What we're stuck with the sort of from the British colonial times. What is the path forward? Is it one comprehensive state? Is it breaking it up into multiple states? Because it seems like at the core of it, it is land, right? It is a small, parcel of land that people are fighting over. I mean, if I'm going to boil it down to something very simple, what is in your mind? What would be the next logical step to try to come up with a resolution?
I mean, if you ask what is the ideal solution, I think any rational person would say that Palestinians and Israelis should live within one state with equal rights. And that would undermine the Zionist goal of creating a Jewish national home. It would be a state of more or less equal populations of Jews and Arabs. But, it's a small landmass. And in an ideal world, if those communities could reconcile with their past and look toward to a better future and live together with equal rights, and that would mean, by the way, that Israelis would have to accept the idea that one day they might have a prime minister elected whose first name is Muhammad. This is something that if you had equal rights for all communities, you could not rule out. The problem is the long history of antagonism between Israelis and Palestinians makes such a vision almost unthinkable. And the divide has grown only more vicious since the attacks of 7 October, which many Israelis viewed as a kind of genocidal initiative by Palestinians to wipe out Israelis altogether. And they asked themselves, how could we ever live with these people as our neighbors? We will never rest assured that they won't rise up in the middle of the night to cut our throats. So, however rational or irrational the outside world may view Israeli fears of Palestinians, I am told by many Israelis that that mindset has really firmly entrenched itself. Palestinians have even more grounds to fear a kind of genocidal violence from the Israeli side because after 15 months of war, what we have seen in Gaza is not so much a war as a systematic killing of Palestinians. It's the killing by bombardment. It's the killing by the elimination of food supplies or safe shelter, leaving people exposed and hungry without access to fresh water and hygiene and sanitation. It's the destruction of the medical infrastructure that might treat the wounded. The wounded taken to hospitals in Gaza, broken as they are now, die. So, for Palestinians, they are absolutely convinced that Israel's intention is to either expel or exterminate them. And they are, supported in that concern by a complaint carried by South Africa to the International Court of Justice accusing Israel of genocide. So with both sides seeing a genocidal threat in the other, it's very hard to imagine how they might agree to live in one state together as equal citizens. So I would postpone that ideal and work with what is the most realizable solution, the one that is most widely recognized by international law and the international communities, which would be a two-state resolution in which a Palestinian state would be created out of those territories occupied Israel in the June 1967 war. Again, that would be all of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. And if I were to add my own twist to that, rather than try and envisage that small parcel of land, only 22% of historic Palestine, that would be the Palestinian state, it would make no sense to have hard boundaries with checkpoints and border controls and all of that. You'd want to see something with the kind of openness of frontiers as characterizes, let us say, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, or maybe the tri-state area of New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey, where you have the free movement of people and of capital and of trade without barriers or impediment. You probably would want to add Jordan to that zone of free movement because so many Palestinians live in Jordan and because Jordan has been a stabilizing factor in a very volatile situation. But I can imagine a way in which if the landmass were shared, but where sovereignty was in 75% of Palestine, Israel, and the other 22% sovereignty was Palestine, I could see a way forward that would satisfy Palestinian national demands and the occupation, which is an unbearable burden for Palestinians and a disruption of their daily lives that is beyond humiliation, it's life-threatening. Put a limit to the ambitions of Israeli settlers to try and encroach into Palestinian territory until there is no capacity to create a Palestinian state. And in this way, establish a viable, enduring peace that would be guaranteed by the very promise of a better future it offers to the next generation of Israelis and Palestinians alike. That's got to be the hook that will drive these deeply divided, traumatized people to come to terms with the future of living together as, recognized sovereign independent states.
And we've seen, the change of borders, in the Middle East, in North Africa. We've seen, as you mentioned, Syria. Is there a possibility, or you mentioned that there's 22% and 78% land allocation. Is that 22%, is that in jeopardy? Could that be 15 and 10? And, it seems like the borders are constantly changing. We have the same number of people. Is it possible that there could be a time where there's just not enough unified territory to make a Palestinian state or to make a two-state solution an option at all?
Well, the real threat to creating a Palestinian state in the 22% left to Palestinians, in which Palestinians are the majority population, is, of course, the settler movement. And the settlers in the West Bank are more than opportunists looking for affordable housing. A majority of them are. But there is a core of the settler movement that is absolutely ideologically driven. And their ideology is a combination of nationalism, they're ardent Zionists, and in many cases, religion. They believe that the West Bank is actually Judea and Samaria, promised to the Jewish people by God, and that they have a divine claim or a divinely sanctioned claim to those lands. That's a very powerful mix of religion and national ideology to combat. And between us, I don't think there'll ever be an Israeli state strong enough to force those ideologically motivated settlers to leave Judea and Samaria. So if I were dictator and were trying to establish the Palestinian state, I would say settlers who wish to remain as Israeli expatriates living in Palestine would be fine. They have to live by Palestinian law, pay Palestinian taxes, in the same way that I, as an American living in Britain, am entitled to buy a house here, to live here. I pay my taxes and I obey the laws here. I can't claim American exceptionalism. I think if you took Israeli soldiers out of the West Bank, so they're no longer there to protect Israeli settlers, it makes it really less attractive. I think Israeli soldiers facilitate settlement. Their withdrawal would discourage settlement. And you'd be left with a group of people who were ideologically wedded to living in the land, but nothing to prevent them from so doing, as long as they recognize that as many Israelis who didn't wish to live in Palestine left their homes and settlements, that those homes would be inhabited by Palestinians. And so these settlements as they are now would come to be increasingly mixed communities. And in that way, as long as settlers were happy to respect the law of the land, you could imagine a future in which settlers and Palestinians could stop fighting and live together at peace. But as long as settlers are exclusivist movements that seize territory that is owned by Palestinians, let us be honest, settlements in the occupied territories are land theft, and they are recognized as that by international law and by most of the international community. As long as you have settlement as land theft that is exclusive and driving Palestinians off their land, settlers are both a barrier to trying to create a viable Palestinian state and a barrier to establishing peace in the region. So this is definitely an issue which will require creative solutions, but needs solutions nonetheless.
Yeah, and it does seem, I mean, we could go, so, like you said, multiple podcast episodes about this, but it does seem like the incentives are not there, or people, it's a situation where, it tends to favor people in the hard line, right? So the idea of compromise right now, there just isn't a good motivating factor for either side. And I think as that happens, as that continues to happen, other events happen that just sort of further the divide between both peoples, and it makes it much more difficult to reach a compromise.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And in a sense, the problem has grown too big for Israelis and Palestinians to solve themselves. Let's be clear. This is a crisis that was created by the international community. It was the new United Nations that in November 1947 voted this time definitively, to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. And it was in rejection of that United Nations General Assembly resolution to partition Palestine that you got the first Arab-Israeli war in Palestine between, let's say, the end of 47 and up to May 1948. And then with the British withdrawal in mid-May 1948 and the invasion of Palestine by neighboring Arab armies, the first Arab-Israeli war. So Palestine and Israel are a creation of the international community. They're created by United Nations resolutions. The United Nations has continued to issue resolutions now more through the Security Council than the 1947 case, which was by the General Assembly. And I believe that the international community will be essential to bring Israelis and Palestinians to a resolution. And that's why I feel this is something that would be best done not through negotiation at this point, but by the application of international law. So international law does not recognize Israel's right to territory beyond its June 1967 boundaries. So in that sense, I wouldn't try and renegotiate the boundaries or talk about land swaps. Recognize Palestine within the June 5th, 1967 boundaries of East Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza Strip. If, in some future date, sovereign Palestine and sovereign Israel wish to renegotiate their boundaries, well and good. That would be a decision between two sovereign states. But for the international community to come down clearly and recognize Palestine's right to establish a state within its borders as recognized by the international community, and for those territories to be under Palestinian rule of law, and then to address the position of settlers within that situation, have a total withdrawal of Israeli forces from all of Palestinian territories, and for the United Nations or other parts of the international community to serve as the guarantors or those who would maintain the peace in a way that they failed to do since 1948 would be, I think, essential to help bring this conflict to a resolution. And that, you may say, is more than we can expect of the international community or the United Nations. But this isn't charity we're talking about. We're talking about resolving a conflict that has boiled for over 3/4 of a century, has proven a cancer in the very heart of the Middle East, and is really an essential first step to move forward the resolution of a whole host of conflicts that, so long as Israel and Palestine goes unreconciled, will continue to fester. So this is an issue that the international community must address. We cannot once again, in the aftermath of this horrendous Gaza war, believe that we can look away and it'll solve itself. Actions must be taken. The international communities must encourage both sides to come together, and a reasonable solution as defined by international law must be applied, or else we'll be back here again. There will be violence again that takes us to war, and it'll be again deferring for another generation, a future of peace and harmony. This can't go on.
And you bring up a good point that it seems like throughout, talking about these kind of sort of conflicts and border shifts, within borders. Your latest book, Damascus Events, right? Syria has just very recently had over the last 10 or 15 years has had some massive changes, but especially in the last few weeks. How does their history, tie into what we see today, or is there a tie between what you covered in the book and where we are now when it comes to Syria, for example?
It's so interesting, Anil, because I wrote the Damascus Events out of love of a wealth of documents that I had found on an 1860 massacre of Christians. It's a very important event, and many of us treat this as a kind of starting point for the modern history of the Middle East, because of the changes that took place in the aftermath of those massacres. But in the case of Damascus, it was the Ottoman government that had to rebuild and reintegrate the surviving Christian community and to try and restore law and order over the unruly city of Damascus after terrible bloodletting in 1860 that killed 5,000 Christians, burnt down all the Christian quarters. What the Ottomans succeeded in doing demonstrated the effectiveness of Ottoman rule in a way which goes against the grain of many who see the Ottomans in the late 19th century as in terminal decline. They were actually quite effective, not just in rebuilding the Christian quarters and in reconciling relations between Christians and Muslims, but in establishing a kind of non-sectarian legacy. And I contrast that with Lebanon, right next door, which also had a series of Christian massacres, different historical circumstances, but in 1860, same summer. And in a sense, in rebuilding Lebanon after their sectarian violence, the politics of Lebanon were established on a sectarian basis that survives right down to the present day, where the president of Lebanon must be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister must be a Sunni Muslim, the speaker of the parliament a Shiite Muslim. This kind of confessional system in which government office is assigned to different religious communities. And in this way, religion divides the Lebanese rather than citizenship uniting them. The Ottomans avoided that in Damascus, and they created a non-sectarian legacy in the aftermath of the Damascus events that would, in a sense, be preserved and maintained through French imperialism. The French who were constantly trying to play on minority communities to try and contain the Sunni Muslim majority's bid for independence. So they were constantly trying to play confessional politics in Damascus. And yet that Ottoman legacy of sectarian, uh, or secular non-sectarian politics survived. It survived in independence under the Ba'athist state. The Ba'ath indeed being a party created by an Orthodox Christian and a Sunni Muslim, and created an Arab nationalist movement that saw all of the diversity of Syria as common citizens. And watching since December of last year, the fall of the Assad regime and the rise to power of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the kind of Salafi Sunni Muslim organization that the West most feared would prevail in Syria because of their roots in Al-Qaeda and in the Islamic State movement. And yet we see in Ahmed al-Shara, the new leader of Syria, the head of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, a commitment to preserve the cultural and religious diversity of Syria, in which Christians, Muslims, Druze, Sunnis, Shiis, Kurds, Alawis all share historic identity as Syrians. You can see not just a kind of preservation of sectarian equality, but the preservation of a secular order that dates right back to the Damascus events and Ottoman reconstruction. If they can pull this off, then they will prove to be the, upholders of an Ottoman legacy that everyone would have written off many years ago.
It is a fascinating history. So I hope people will read both books and all of your books. Like I said, there is so much that we assume, and I think you bring home at least a good point that I'm taking away is that the divisions, right? There's the divisions between in the news, or I think a lot of people think, well, this group of people just hates this group of people, and I feel like the incentives are not there, right? To create an idea, an identity which is above sort of someone's religion or maybe their clan or something like that. And it seems like that's something that might have happened in Syria in terms of creating this sort of national identity, which goes above those divisions that all countries, that all states have to sort of create a stabilizing factor.
Well, as President Lincoln said, a house divided won't stand. And so if you take your body politic and fragment it by ethnicity or by sect, then you're laying the seeds of future divisions. And while everyone wishes, full political participation by all religious communities, that they don't do so as exclusive political parties might be a way to preserve the diversity and cultural richness of countries with lots of different religious and ethnic communities.
Thank you so much for your time. I'll sneak in one question. We've talked a lot about conflict. Is there a bright spot today that you see that you say something, this is really going right and people should take more attention of this in the Arab world, or a sort of a bright spot that we don't really know about or focus on?
There are two that I would highlight to listeners, and one is just in culture. the Arab world continues to be a dynamic, thriving, and vital part of world culture. And all you have to do is go to your local bookshop and go to the section of literature and translation and look at the wealth of Arabic novels now making their way into English or French or Italian or German. And you realize that right across the Arabophone geosphere, there are just brilliant creative authors at work. The same is true for film and so much of sort of the creative enterprise, art, sculpture. The Arabs are, amazingly diverse creators of cultural outputs that are really making an impact on world culture in the 21st century. But the other is political. And in a sense, it is the willingness of these young populations. I mean, one of the things that defines the Arab world is, the overwhelming majority of their population is under the age of 30, to rise up against autocratic rulers and demand their rights. We saw it in 2011 with the Arab Spring revolutions. And even when they were put down and replaced by new authoritarians, we've seen a continuing wave of movements rise up in Algeria in 2019, in the Hirak movement, in Sudan, which tragically has led to another civil war between military factions, in Iraq, rejecting a kind of new sectarianism in favor of preserving their national identity and demanding accountability of their government, in Lebanon with the You Stink movement, challenging the sclerotic rule of the old warlords and confessional leaders. The youth of the Arab world has not stopped in its bid to overthrow the old order and replace it with one that respects their rights. And I can't help to believe that between the creativity and the cultural level and the drive of the younger generation of Arabs to establish accountable government, that if we can get beyond the conflicts through resolution and diplomacy and move into a new age of political reconstruction, that the 21st century yet could belong to the Arab world.
That is a great note to end on. And I think, learning about the history, knowing, I feel maybe it's the sort of the way I think, but I always feel like, there seems to be a sort of logical outcome to decisions people have made in the past that lead us here, and that the resolutions should be, similarly follow some kind of logic, with the idea that down the line we solve problems rather than creating them, and I think your books definitely do a really good job of educating, and I think this episode will really sort of open people's eyes up into to thinking about just the Middle East, North Africa, the Arab world in a different way. So I thank you for your time. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks, Anil. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Eugene, for being a guest on the podcast. And thank all of you for listening. Make sure you check out the links down in the description to check out all of Dr. Rogan's books. I think you're going to really, if you enjoyed this conversation, you're really going to enjoy the books. Thank you all again for listening. And if you have some time, maybe leave this episode a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. Give it a like and a subscribe on YouTube. Thank you again for listening and watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.